And the reason why I'm saying that this is the most pressing issue for humanity is because we are being quick-marched towards the precipice of a nuclear confrontation that the United States authorities knowingly are making a real possibility. And the question is why? The first question. And once we go through the analysis, then of course the second question, and of equal importance, is so what do we do about it? I enjoy very much placing American and British in particular journalists who are part of this propaganda machine, Financial Times, Guardian, Washington Post, placing them in a difficult position with a very simple question. Why? Why is the United States declaring essentially a new Cold War against China? And the first word that comes out of their mouth is Taiwan. And I said to them, what about Taiwan? They said, well, the Chinese want to take it over. Well, I said, they always wanted to take it over. What's new? I mean, it was always the position of Beijing that Taiwan is a province of China. And at some point, they will have to fall under the fold, like Hong Kong did. Didn't Richard Nixon know that in 1971 when he was visiting Beijing, making friends with China? Didn't Clinton know that when he was inducting China into the World Trade Organization? Why wasn't Taiwan a problem then? What has changed now? They look at me, well, China is spying on us. The NSA is spying on you. The CIA, I have, and that is the truth, and the line knows this, we have a 3-point NSA tap on me. My phone, that is 3 points means that if I talk to you, you're spied on. If you talk to your wife is spied on. If your wife talks to your child, your child. So I know that, they've told me that. So I don't believe the Chinese are as good as the NSA at spying. I mean, the NSA was listening in to Chancellor Angela Merkel, that was revealed. And then, when Angela Merkel was told that, immediately she said, okay, do you want me to speak louder so you can hear me better? So it wasn't a problem, right? Now suddenly, that China is developing surveillance, and I hope China is developing surveillance methods, because, if you're being spied on, you need to spy back on them. It's the only way. One of my great friends, and I'm very proud of that may shock some of you, is Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. And Julian Assange, a very brave man, said to me once that, what do you do with Big Brother? How do you stop Big Brother? Well, what you do is you develop the technology so that you spy on him while he's spying on you. So counter surveillance is the only way of dealing with surveillance, so that they know that you know that they know. This is essential for maintaining any degree of autonomy. So I hope China is developing its capacity to counter the surveillance of the NSA. And it's a joke. I mean, the people in the NSA are laughing their heads off when they hear journalists from the Wall Street Journal saying that the reason for the new Cold War is that China is spying on the Americans. And then I hear other idiotic answers like, the Chinese are building naval vessels, they are projecting naval power. Well, I will believe this. I mean, of course, you're building naval vessels. You're expanding your economy, you're expanding your capacity to project your own power. That is essential. That's what every country must do if it respects its own interests. But I'm going to be worried about Chinese imperialism when I see Chinese vessels outside San Diego and Los Angeles and Chinese army bases next to El Paso on the US-Mexican border. Until we see that, it is ludicrous. You just look at the map of the Pacific and you see American bases everywhere creating choke points for China. And this is their official policy for 40 years. And they have the audacity to say that China is a threat because China is... Anyway, enough time wasted on these non-explanations of the new Cold War. Now, you may have heard of, I won't mention him yet. The more sophisticated analysts in the United States would invoke the so-called Thucydides trap or Thucydides curse, that, to put it in very vulgar terms, if you live in an anarchic world, if you are a child, a boy, and you go to school, a very rough school, and there are lots of bullies, you should be the biggest and nastiest bully. That is the cynical, realist school of thought of American geopolitics, that America, in this anarchic world, because they don't really believe in God, they don't believe there is a God that will help them, they think that they must be the nastiest, biggest bully in the world in order to defend themselves. Their survival as a nation and their prosperity will depend on their capacity to bully everybody else, and from preventing anyone who is getting too big for their boots to become an equally sized bully. And they will say to you that they were bullies around the world, like, for instance, Imperial Japan, Imperial Germany, the Soviet Union, and what the United States have succeeded in doing is effectively eliminating them, annihilating them, getting them out of the way. And that now China is rising, China is next. And therefore that explains the new Cold War. Now there's no doubt that the deep state in the United States, and make no mistake, the United States is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy with elections that are providing the legitimacy for this one-party state to continue to exist. And when I say a one-party state, I mean one-party state. Take, for instance, Victoria Nuland. You may be familiar with this diplomat of the Washington establishment. Victoria Nuland worked for Bill Clinton. She worked for George W. Bush. She worked under Clinton. She worked under Trump. Victoria Nuland is an example of the single state, deep state of the United States. Now, that deep state, single party establishment in the United States is split along the line of two different conflicting views, neither of which is good news for China. There is the more intelligent, nuanced line of thinking, that which in academia is represented by that very intelligent man from the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer. The view is this: they are very critical of the inability of Washington to focus on what is necessary, and their overreach. They think that the United States is overreaching. So they are very critical of the war, of the United States' role in, firstly, through Victoria Nuland, creating the circumstances through the coup d'etat against Viktor Yanukovych, the then president of Ukraine in 2014. They created the coup d'etat in order ethnically to cleanse Russian speakers from the eastern side of Ukraine, in order to provoke Putin into the first stage of war in 2014 against Ukraine, so as to push for NATO expansion in Scandinavia and, of course, Georgia and Ukraine. And so this pragmatic viewpoint simply says that we shouldn't be doing this, because that way we are pushing Russia into the arms of China. And the whole point of the Nixon administration was to split the Soviet Union from China and therefore win the Cold War. So they are critical of the support of Ukraine and of Israel, because they think that this simply disorients the United States policy. It creates alliances amongst Americans' enemies, like alliances between Russia and China, Iran and Russia, and so on. And that this is silly politics because the enemy is China. And China needs to be contained. And if you ask them, why does China need to be contained? China doesn't have a history of imperialism. China has absolutely no interest in building military bases on the US-Mexican border, in taking, naval power and projecting it to San Diego or Los Angeles or San Francisco. China doesn't want that. China wants to trade. You know what they say? Yes, we agree. But if we let China become a regional superpower in the Pacific area, in its own area, in its backyard, if we allow China, for instance, to become dominant in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean, then China in the future will start trying to do what we have done. And they will become an imperialistic force in the Western Hemisphere, which for them is the Americas. This is what they say. They understand that China is not imperialistic, but they fear that if they do not contain China through choke points, just north of Indonesia, the first array of islands, the second array of islands between China and the Philippines and so on, then China will emulate the United States, and therefore you better prevent that by choking China today. So that's one line of argument. The second line of argument is the opposite argument, that the United States must be a bully everywhere, all over the world, including in Europe, including the Ukraine, and that, for instance, I have been told that by somebody who was very high up in the Bush administration and who was very high up in the chain of command of NATO in Brussels, an American Republican. He said to me that we need to expand NATO against the interests of the Europeans. He was clear, against the interests of the Europeans. And I said to him, Bob, why? He said, because of three reasons. First, because we must be in Europe, the United States, to keep ourselves in. Number one reason he gave me. Number two, to keep the Germans down. Look at the price of electricity in Germany today as a result of the war in Ukraine. The German industrial machine is finished, kaput, as a result, not just of that, but that is one of the reasons. And thirdly, to keep the Russians out. So this is, if you were in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., this is the discussion you would hear. The containment of China, the choking of China, is common ground for all of them. They simply disagree on how to do it best, whether to do it through the war in Ukraine or, as Trump suggests, end the war in Ukraine and concentrate on China. Well, this, so far, what I have presented to you, is more or less common knowledge amongst anyone who's ever been in Washington, been in Brussels, spoken to these people, to the Cold Warriors, to the new Cold Warriors. This is common knowledge. But I think that story that I've given you so far is incomplete. Why did the Clinton administration and the Bush administration after that were so gung-ho about trading with China? Why did they not start the new Cold War against China in the 1990s, in the year 2000, in 2004, 2005, 2008? Why was it only around 2014 that this establishment decided to unleash the war against China? It's not that one explanation is that the Clinton administration people could not see that China would develop to the extent that China developed, that it would become so big. I don't believe that. I never believe explanations which presume the stupidity of the people involved. I don't believe that these people were stupid. And I don't believe that they didn't see that by shifting half of American manufacturing to the west coast of China, to the east coast of China, that China would not grow and develop. They knew it. They were celebrating it. I remember, for years hearing that, capitalism is fantastic because look at China. The moment it introduced the market economy, and they become a superpower. So they knew it and they wanted it. Why don't they want it now? Why is it suddenly choking points and containment and, putting a boot on their neck? What really changed? For me, the essence of the pursuit of a new Cold War against China by the United States. By the way, Europe is irrelevant. Europe is simply doing as it's told. Europe doesn't want to unleash a Cold War against China, but, they get the email from Washington, D.C., do it, and they do it. Against their interests and against their wishes. So don't care about the Europeans. It's Washington. If you were somebody like, a strategic thinker like Henry Kissinger, who is now dead, but this is the example of the deep thinking American official. What would you really be worried about? Since I mentioned Kissinger, let me stick to him for a moment. The year was 1970. Kissinger, at the time, who was working for President Nixon, you'll recall, was not the foreign minister, was not in the State Department yet. He was the head of the National Security Council, and he was the National Security Advisor to the American president. And he was the epitome, all his life, of American strategic thinking, the thinking of that one-party state, the deep state of the United States. Being a smart man, when he saw the macroeconomic statistics, and he saw that from 1968 onwards, America, for the first time since the 1930s, had become a deficit country. For the first time in its history, since it became a superpower or an important power in the mid-war period, and certainly since the 1950s, when it was the only superpower in terms of economic superpower, the United States slipped from being a surplus country, from having a surplus in its trade balance, to having a deficit. And Kissinger was worried, because he knew that, historically speaking, every empire that went from being a surplus to a deficit economic entity started fading. So he got together his people at the National Security Council, and he asked them a simple question. What should we do in order to retain our hegemony, now that we are a deficit country? And he said to the people, go away and think about it, and I want from each one of you half a page of a note. Very interesting, right? Not 20 pages, half a page. Not a page, half a page. This is how Kissinger worked. And these were very smart people, right? Most of them came back and gave a very Germanic answer. If we have a deficit, we must cut down our expenditure, we must increase interest rates and so on and so forth in order to reduce imports and bring about a balance between exports and imports to eliminate our trade deficit. One man, in his half a page, which I actually acquired in the process of writing a book 15 years ago, a typewritten half a page, he said, what we must do, we must treble our deficit. We have a deficit which is bad. We must make it 3 times as big and make the capitalists of the rest of the world pay for it. Which is exactly what happened. The United States should increase its deficit and use it to create aggregate demand for the net exports of Germany and Japan. And later on, China. Because it is the trade deficit of the United States that sucks into the United States your aluminum, your electric vehicles, deficit dollars, like IOUs. And, when people ask Paul Volcker, but will that not affect the value of the dollar? He said, no, not as long as it is the only world reserve currency. The only currency that has demand, people demand it, even if they don't want to buy anything from the country which is producing it, which is printing it. So, if you are today somebody of a mind comparable to Kissinger's, then you know that the reason why the United States is so hegemonic, why it can afford to be the big bully around the world, is because of the monopoly of the payment system. When Trump was elected, because he hated Obama so deeply, he wanted to take down something that Obama was very proud of. Obama was very proud of two things, Obamacare and the agreement between the West and Iran over the nuclear program of Iran and the ending of the sanctions, which was signed by Iran, by the United States, and by the whole of the European Union, enthusiastically. And Trump wanted to destroy that agreement just because he hated Obama. So he takes the agreement with Iran and tears it up. The Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, was very annoyed because she had worked very hard together with Obama to bring about that agreement with Iran. And German businesses were already in negotiations in Iran to enter Iran. Iran is a land of opportunity after so many years of sanctions for large conglomerates like the German ones, especially when it came to energy, to consumer products, to car manufacturing. They were all ready to get in. And Trump says, no. Merkel comes out and gives a press conference against the President of the United States. This is unprecedented. That doesn't happen often. And she says, I do not know what the United States will do. We respect their opinion and their position, but Germany is going to maintain the agreement, the peace agreement with Iran. And German businesses will continue to do business in Iran on the basis of this international agreement, which we are going to fulfill and which we're going to honor. Within 12 hours, every single CEO of every German conglomerate came out and said, not us, we're not in, we're out. We will follow the Americans. Why? It's really very simple, because they depended on their net exports to the United States. And the Trump administration threatened them that they would not benefit from the tax cuts, the reductions in the corporate tax that Trump was bringing in. He said to them, you want to benefit from them? No business in Iran. You want to maintain your access to the dollar payment system? No business with Iran. So the German conglomerate leaders turned against the German chancellor the day after she gave a press conference, effectively saying, sorry, Chancellor, we are going with President Trump on this. Against their own financial interests in Iran and in Europe, which is exactly what they're doing now. The United States, together with Ukraine, bomb the pipeline, Nord Stream 1, that costs billions every week for German industry. Have you heard a German industry say anything? Nothing. Because they are dependent on the American trade deficit. But this whole thing, for the trade deficit of the United States to function as a vacuum cleaner that sucks into the United States the net exports of Germany, of France, of Japan, and of China, you need the dollar to remain the monopoly, the monopolistic transaction system. Because it is only the monopoly of transactions that allows the Americans to continue with unfinanced, unfunded deficits.